Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Megan Donaldson, Global Alumni Relations Officer at Trinity Development and Alumni, and you're all very welcome to today's Inspiring Ideas at Trinity webinar on the Genomic History of Ireland. I'm delighted to welcome our guest speakers, Professor Dan Bradley and Dr. Lara Cassidy from Trinity's School of Genetics and Microbiology, who will be sharing some of Trinity's research in the field of population genetics, specifically the history of the Irish population from its ancient origins to its modern day makeup. The talk today will last around 35 minutes and we'll have plenty of time for audience questions at the end of the talk. We encourage as much audience participation as possible, so please do use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can ask questions and you're welcome to pop them in as you think of them throughout the webinar. I'd like to note that we are using Zoom-generated automatic subtitles for this webinar. If you'd like to turn these subtitles on or off, click the CC Closed Captions button at the bottom of your screen, then click Show or Hide Subtitles. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for later viewing on our Trinity Alumni YouTube channel. Now I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers. Professor Dan Bradley is a professor of population genetics and former head of the School of Genetics and Microbiology at Trinity College Dublin. Dan spent his early years on an Irish farm. After a degree in genetics from Cambridge University and PhD in medical genetics from Trinity, he subsequently started to work on the genetics of each species present on that farm, including Irish humans, and has done so for over 30 years. He pioneered the molecular genetic analysis of Irish populations, and with his colleagues, he has combined analysis of ancient and modern humans and livestock to inform on our origins. Dr. Lara Cassidy graduated in human genetics from Trinity College Dublin in 2013, receiving a gold medal for her academic achievements. After working as a research assistant at the National Institute of Genetics in Japan, she is awarded a scholarship by the Irish Research Council to pursue a PhD in ancient genomics at Trinity's Department of Genetics, which she was awarded in 2018. Her doctoral focus was the application of next-generation sequencing technologies to the study of Irish prehistory, which resolved long-standing questions on the origins of the modern population. Throughout her career, Lara has published extensively and with wide-reaching impact in ancient genomics. Her research has been repeatedly featured in top journals such as Nature and Science and covered by major international news outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Guardian, and the BBC. And Lara is now a lecturer in the Department of Genetics at Trinity. So now I will hand you over to Lara and Dan.
Thanks,
Hi.
Megan. Hello. Really nice to be here today.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, and welcome everyone. It's good to be talking to Trinity alumni. Yeah.
So I thought a nice place to start, Dan, would be, well, we heard you've been working in the field of human population genetics for 30 years now, and you've seen a huge amount of change, I suppose, in that time. So it might be nice to start just by asking you, like, what actually can genomes tell us about the past? Why are they useful?
Okay, yes. Well, why not go back? I mean, we have a lot of exciting stuff to say about what came out in the last year or so. So 30 years, my God, it's been a long time. It doesn't seem like a long time, but I've been in Trinity for 30 years. And working in what was the field of human genetics, but now the field of human genomics. Genetics just looks at one gene at a time. Genomics looks at the whole genome all at once. And that's a mark of how the field has changed. But I've always had an interest in the Irish population in particular. And even before the advent of genomics, we knew that Irish populations were interesting because, first of all, geographically, we're on the edge of Europe. So that's something to say, not just about Ireland, but about Europe in general. And secondly, Ireland has world maxima or near maxima for several very important traits that sets it out as being somewhat different. And it's interesting to know, why is that the case? So, for example, we're the world maximum in the world for the ability to drink milk as an adult, so lactose persistence. The opposite of that is lactose intolerance rather, where you get somewhat ill if you drink milk that isn't cooked. Also, we've got people who have an ancestry on the island tend to have the lightest coloured skin in the world. Not everybody in Ireland, of course, but people with an ancestry here. And that's because we've been in this place our ancestors have been here for thousands of years where the sun doesn't shine very much. Also, sadly, it's got maxima for some serious diseases, such as cystic fibrosis, also hemochromatosis, which is a disease of iron overload. And Ireland has got the maximum for that in the world. So these are all pointers as to why it's important to study Ireland. But also, of course, if you're working in Trinity College, we're interested in the particular part of human history or prehistory that took place on this island. You know, the basic question, what is the past? What is the ancestry of people who lived and did live in this island in the past, which is not necessarily the same thing. So that's genetics before ancient DNA. But we also have archaeology before ancient DNA, because ancient DNA is impacting on archaeology now. So Lara, why don't you say something about our understanding of the past in Ireland from archaeology, which I know you're pretty familiar with.
Yeah. So, yeah, you were talking about looking at the modern Irish population and their origins, but it's quite hard with modern genomes to really extend very far back into the past. So looking at the deep past in Ireland, we're really before ancient DNA, we were looking at the archaeological record and seeing if that could maybe tell us anything about the populations who lived on the island in the past, their demographies, the environments they lived in, all of that. But that's revealed a huge amount of stuff. So Ireland actually is one of the last places in the world to have permanent human occupation. So our archaeological record is actually quite young, only 10,000 years of permanent occupation. And for the majority of that time, what we can tell from the material culture, from everything, is that the people living on the island were hunter-gatherers. They got their food from fishing and hunting and gathering. But what we also see in the Irish archaeological record is two major cultural transformations that we see across Europe. And the first big one, the real game changer, is farming, right? Agriculture, livestock, cereals, and the population growth that allowed, and the social complexity that allowed. And then our second big transformation, so we have the first farming societies in Ireland for about 1,000 years or so. And then we have metalworking. So we have bronze and gold, and that comes into Ireland with a whole new set of cultural packages and belief systems. So we could see all this in the Irish archaeological record, but the really big question, and a question that couldn't be resolved really, was whether these cultural changes involved a movement of people or a movement of ideas, right? So is it technology spreading, or are we having large-scale movement of new people into the island at these points in time? And that was a very big debate in archaeology, because you can't really infer migration from a change in material culture alone. And that was why ancient DNA technology, which came on the scene about the time I started my PhD, that was why ancient DNA just had a very big impact. But I think, Dan, you witnessed this revolution, but you also drove this revolution. Your lab made some of the first big discoveries in ancient genomics. So I might throw it back to you just to talk a bit about the start of the field.
Well, just on the migration, I mean, when I first started engaging with archaeology, I got the idea that migration was really not a very popular idea. That the idea that people brought new things with them, sometimes by something like colonization, to use a very loaded term, it wasn't popular. It was seen as an idea with its roots in an old way of thinking, a colonial way of thinking. And the alternative is that ideas moved and not people. And that was seen certainly 20 years ago as more as the favored idea. Would you agree, Lara? Would you say that's true?
Definitely, definitely. And there was a swing. There was a swing from migration theory to theories of cultural diffusion in the 70s and 80s. And it wasn't clear why that happened, but the data was silent. I don't think that there was much evidence really for diffusion over migration.
Yeah. So this is the big question. Did people move and bring new ideas with them, or did the ideas move and get adopted by locals? And these are big ideas. These are big changes, as Lara has said. So the advent of ancient genomics really draws not really from technology in our own field, although there are some interesting or some useful things like which bones give best DNA. And one of the things that we discovered here was that the petrous bone, which is an inner ear bone, is the densest bone in the body, and it gives the best preservation for DNA. But really, the ancient genomics has been driven by the revolution in DNA sequencing. So the first human genome took 10 years and hundreds of millions of dollars to achieve, to sequence. And now you can get a genome sequenced for a few $100s. And the sort of information you get from commercial genotyping companies, ancestry companies, is just phenomenal compared to the sort of incredibly little information that I used to get when I worked hard as a PhD student, or even sometimes not so hard. So that has driven it. Our field has become a data science. It's become data driven by this huge amount of information that we can get from genomes in the past. We can sequence someone's genome in the past just as well now as we can sequence a modern person's genome. A bit more expensively, a bit more fiddly, but it can be done. So what was discovered? So we did a bit, as Lara mentioned, but of course there are huge efforts going on across the world, particularly in Europe. And one of the things that was discovered by other labs from Harvard and Copenhagen was in early studies in Europe that these changes, the change from hunter-gathering to farming, and farming gets invented in the Near East, in the Fertile Crescent, in modern-day Syria, Anatolia, Turkey, and Levant, and then moves into Europe. Did it come with people, or did it come as an idea? Well, the data shows unambiguously it came with people. People moved and they brought farming with them. They brought the crops and they brought the livestock. And then secondly, in the third millennium BC, so between 2000 and 3000 BC, there's another big change in genomes where Northern European genomes have this big influx from the steppe, from above the Black Sea, from above the Caspian Sea. So two big changes. The second one is associated somewhat with metallurgy, with metal usage, and other aspects. So certainly on mainland Europe, the answer, do these big changes occur with movement, or are they just the more benign idea of ideas moving? The answer is unequivocally, there are migrations involved, big migrations. Now, there may be details in different places that differ from that, but the central theme is migrations and great waves of population change. Big population change, not small population change, big movements, overwhelming movements of what was there before. So one big question, whenever Lara started her PhD work, that we really wanted to address was, did these great waves of change wash all the way to Ireland? So the hunter-gatherers that were here before, and they were like the hunter-gatherers in Europe, and there were only a few thousand, were they the people who adopted farming? And then did their descendants adopt metallurgy, or did these things happen with great movements? So Lara, why don't you tell us what you discovered whenever you started in this?
Yeah. And I think it's like important to note how far Ireland is away from the Near East, from the steppe region. Do we get these Near Eastern and steppe ancestries moving all the way out to the very, very continental edge? And that's, I started my PhD with Dan in 2013. And one of the first things we did was we drove up to Queen's University in Belfast to collect 4 petrous bones. One came from a woman an adult woman from a megalithic tomb in Balnahattie in County Down. So she belonged to the first farming societies of Ireland. And then what we also had were 3 men from the Bronze Age of Rathlin Island. And we sequenced their genomes, we compared them, and what we found was that the Bronze Age men, their ancestry was completely different to that of Balnahattie women. They had this steppe type ancestry that we see come into Northern Europe during the late Neolithic and Bronze. For Balnahattie then, her ancestry looked like it was coming from the Near East, and was radically different to that of the hunter-gatherer populations before her in turn. So what we are seeing in Ireland is what we are seeing in the continent. We are seeing population turnover and replacement that maps up really well to these major cultural transformations in the archaeological record. But I suppose then, one of the questions in that, which you have to ask is what happened, right? What happened to the earlier populations? Did they contribute anything at all? Did they contribute genomically? Did they contribute ancestrally to the later populations? And we have been exploring that, and we have found a few incidences of flow through, which is very exciting, because we're still talking about really massive population replacement. We are getting these snapshots of interaction. And one we saw in the Burren, in County Clare, in a megalithic tomb down there, where we have a individual from a farming society, an adult man, with a hunter-gatherer individual in his recent family tree, probably a great-grandparents. That's a really nice sort of capture of that on a very local level. We also see, with our Neolithic to Bronze Age transition, some evidence of flow-through, but again, it's looking like an 80-90% population replacement overall. And then it's that moment, that period, that early Bronze Age, that's when we see the establishment of what we can think of as the modern Irish gene pool. We have very strong genetic continuity from the early Bronze Age onwards in Ireland, right up to the modern period, so about 4,000 years or so. And I think that, that helped answer, and these Bronze Age men contain some mutations that we do see at quite high frequency in the Irish population today. I don't know if, Dan, if you want to chat a bit about this. You were talking about lactase and hemochromatosis earlier on.
I will, but I have a question first, Lara. Let's see what yours is. This change from the few thousand hunter-gatherers who were here, let's say less than 10,000 hunter-gatherers, to what became maybe 100,000 or more farmers when they first came in. Do you think it was violent, or might it have been violent, or do we just don't know? Was it an overwhelming, or what do you think what it was like?
I do not think we can speak on that from the genetic data. As you just said, we could be talking about radically different population sizes here. So you could have a situation where the Irish hunter-gatherer population was completely integrated in, but just the sheer numbers of migrants coming in overwhelmed in time any genetic contribution, diluted it down to the point that we just can't detect it anymore, which is why the snapshots of admixture are so interesting. Perhaps the way that those questions are going to be addressed is looking more at the archaeological material, looking at evidence for trauma on bones, things like that. The Bronze Age is a different story. Again, there's the Bronze Age migrations in Central Europe anyway, there is evidence that they were male mediated in places with very little contribution from men of the earlier farming societies. So that might tell a different story.
It might, yeah. A story still to be told, I guess. Yeah, so you mentioned that in those in the Bronze Age, there were some interesting genes. So yeah, we did find that they had the genetic variant for lactose tolerance, which is present almost at a very high frequency in Ireland today. And also we found the first instance of a genetic disease gene, in prehistory, which was the gene for hemochromatosis, which again, although it's not as common as lactose tolerance, is more common in Ireland than it is elsewhere. This disease that leads to iron overload and sometimes can be serious, although it can be treatable, can be treated by phlebotomy, by blood being taken off. So yeah, we got a sense, and we confirmed it with more statistical analysis, that at that stage in the Bronze Age, 4,000 years ago, with these rattling genomes, that there was some setting up of the Irish genome. That's when the genome as we see it today started to appear. It started to look like what we see today, and similar to Irish people today, but also to Welsh people and to Scottish people. So people in the western parts of these islands.
I think on that point as well, we stress continuity here, but also there's change. Genetic populations are never static. They're fluid. So we can look at the modern Irish population today and see the impact of later movements like Vikings, Normans, the plantation period. They've all left their own smaller marks, but nothing that can wipe out that signature of continuity from the Bronze Age.
Yes, that's an important point. And it is human nature. Humans breed with each other. And if they are there beside each other, they will breed. And there's no such thing as something like a pure, undiluted race stretching back into prehistory. It's just not a thing. It's just. I
think actually, what ancient DNA has told us in the past decade or so is the opposite. Nearly all human populations today are the result of admixtures and meetings. Human history is just full of isolation and remeeting and isolation and admixing again and again, and more through time as well, as populations have gotten bigger and technology has allowed more movement of people.
Yes, absolutely. So you mentioned the Burren. The Burren in County Clare actually has a lot of archaeology, as I'm sure people are well aware of. For example, Poulnabrone is a beautiful place in Clare. Also, it turns out, is really good for ancient DNA preservation, because limestone is good for ancient DNA. Acid soils are bad for ancient DNA, but alkali soils and rocks such as limestone are good for ancient DNA preservation through time. And we did find one individual in Poulnabrone that was interesting. Lara, do you want to say? Yeah, that was.
Yes. So this was an infant. This was the remains of a male infant who actually had a chemical signature of breastfeeding. But being able to sequence his genome, we were able to look at his chromosome profile, and what we found was he had 3 copies of chromosome 21, which is the cause of Down syndrome. So this is showing another very important application of ancient DNA, is that we can use it to study genetic disease and disability in the past that actually might be quite invisible in the archaeological record, and that can actually give us like a very nice window into the life experiences and social values of people living in the past, rather than just these big broad population movements. We can go in and look at individual life histories, which is very exciting, I think.
Yeah. So that was unexpected. That's one of the great things about doing this weresearch, is that, well, we find previously unattainable information, and it's almost like exploring. You're exploring a new landscape, and you're finding things that you didn't think were there. So we did find one thing from Newgrange. So I'm sure everybody's aware that in Ireland we've got these amazing megalithic tombs from the Neolithic, from this time of early farmers before the Bronze Age, and they're a special thing in Ireland. For example, in that Boyne Valley region, there's a concentration of megalithic tombs, and the most famous of those is Newgrange, which is a passage tomb. And whenever we were lucky enough, with the collaboration of the National Museum, to be able to sample some bone, a bone from the actual heart of Newgrange, from the ceremonial center of the passage tomb, the place where the the light once a year stretches down and illuminates the inner chamber. And this was a bone that had been excavated decades ago by Kelly. We found something that we really didn't expect. Something really we didn't expect. So Lara, do you want to tell us?
I remember this well. I definitely thought that I had done something wrong. I remember showing this to Dan, several double takes. So basically, to understand what we were seeing, we inherit a set of chromosomes from our mother and a set of chromosomes from our father. And if our mother and father are closely related, what we're going to see is big stretches of identity between these two sets of chromosomes, where the mother and father's chromosomes are identical. And this individual had huge, long stretches of identicalness between his maternal and paternal chromosomes. And they added up actually to about 25% of this man's genome. So this is what we call an inbreeding coefficient of 25%. And what we could tell was that this man, he was the son of either a parent and offspring union or full siblings, which is extremely, extremely rare, because you see, this is first degree incest, and this is one of the very few cultural universal taboos, right? This is extremely rare and absent across all human societies known. But there are a few exceptions, a handful, I think less than 10, and they occur in a lot of different diverse societies, or have occurred worldwide. And these societies, within them, these societies that sanction first degree incest, there's a few striking similarities here. So in all of them, it occurs among an elite class, and even more than that, it's usually only allowed within a royal couple or royal family or clan. And within this, the union, it's typically seen as divine. There's some type of deification, which seems to allow this very deeply ingrained biological aversion to be overcome to a certain extent. And these societies, I'm sure some of you know of them yourself. Famous ones are obviously ancient Egypt, the Incas, but you also have it in Hawaii as well. So this suggested to us that maybe we are seeing a similar set of social dynamics at play in the megalithic building societies of Ireland. But there was another interesting thing about this man, which I think actually got a bit overlooked sometimes during all of the coverage of the news coverage of that, which was he actually had distant relatives interred in other passage tomb sites in Ireland. So he had a 6th degree relative in County Sligo in a passage tomb complex called Carrowkeel, which is it's a spectacular site. I don't know if anybody's been to it. I would recommend going walking up in those hills. And in one of the passage tombs, they're all perched on the top of mountains and hills surrounding this Loch Arrow. But in one of these cairns up there, we sequenced cranial fragments from it again, and we found this relative of Newgrange, 100 kilometers away in Sligo. And he actually also dated to 200 years after the individual at Newgrange. So there's potentially an almost direct genealogical link there between those two sites. So, I mean, that was, as Dan said, like, you just really don't know what you're going to get when you start to sequence ancient genomes. And I feel like there's probably going to be a lot more surprises. I think one of the things we always have to understand about the past is that it is a completely different country in many ways. And you really can't make any assumptions, can you, Dan? I don't think. No. So if I'm, would you agree that it's what we found there is a really unusual genome, as son of a brother-sister union? That's really unusual, and that can be because of a tragic
circumstance, or it can be because of a criminal circumstance. But because it's there in the prestigious heart of one of the most prestigious burial places in ancient Ireland, we're arguing that it's probably not an accident, that it is probably a signature of elite, of some nature of elite. Isn't that right?
That's key. The key is social sanctioning of first degree incest. When it's socially sanctioned, it is universally an elite phenomenon.
Yeah.
So, well, adding up the probabilities there of this man being interred, especially where he was placed in Newgrange within the right-hand recess, almost quite close to where the solstice light hits. And then also his having relatives in other prestigious passage tomb sites across the island. It's all pointing towards a closely related group of individuals, an elite who have access to burial in these sites over a prolonged period of time.
Yeah, so it's on the balance of probabilities, and we think it's unlikely. It's an unlikely coincidence that it's an accident.
But I don't know. I think there's so much more future sampling and interrogation of these results to be done. But we're kind of coming towards the end. I wanted to ask you, Dan, before we finish up, as somebody who's sort of seen it all, I suppose, at this stage, where do you see the actual future of the field of ancient DNA going in general and also in Ireland? What do you think the big unanswered questions are?
Well, I think in Ireland it's sort of obvious in that we've published up until the start of the Bronze Age. It's to publish on further. What happens in the Bronze Age, what happens in the Iron Age, what happens in that period just before history starts, when St. Patrick arrives. What sort of movement is there in and out of the island, and where from? And what are the genomes like? What's the population sizes like? So that's really interesting and a cool thing to look at. And then I think maybe the craziest thing that's happened in ancient DNA over the last, there's the sun out, over the last while, is that people have started, instead of getting DNA from bones, they've started taking little samples of soil in archaeological digs, particularly in caves, and extracting DNA from those. And they're finding human DNA, animal DNA in that. So it's like archaeology without bones. And that's really cool. It would be really exciting to try something like that in Ireland. And then maybe find some more of those people who lived here in the distant past before farming, who were hunter-gatherers, because there's very few of those. What do you think, Lara?
I think that's a big open question, and there's been some really cool work done by people like Ruth Carton looking at evidence for human occupation in Ireland before we have any evidence of human remains. So things like carving marks on bones that are very old, stretching right back into the last glacial period. So to be able to maybe find a trace of these people in the soil, maybe even an Irish Neanderthal, something like that, going really far back in human and hominin evolutionary history, that would be tremendous. But I don't know. Yeah, you have to get lucky, I suppose.
Oh yeah, well, we have been lucky so far. So there it is. The winter sun is shining in on us, just like the solstice at Newgrange. So that's a good time to stop.
Thank you both. I'm back again. That was absolutely brilliant. Like, you have touched on so many different aspects of your work and given us some really interesting things to think about. And we have lots of questions coming in from the audience, so thank you very much. And I'd like to start off with this question from Dennis Smith. And he is asking, he says, you have identified 2 medical conditions which are particularly significant in Ireland. What other medical conditions are high in other countries and continents, but possibly low in Ireland?
Oh, well, maybe I can speak to that. Well, there are a number of, there's 2 ways in which medical conditions can become high in a population. One is just sheer bad luck because of small population size in the past, and just by drift, it gets high. So there's one, for example, in Ashkenazi Jewish populations, Tay-Sachs condition. But another way in which conditions can become high is because of selection, because whereas they cause disease, they also, when they're present in one copy, can alleviate disease. And in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, there a few mutations to do with blood disorders, such as sickle cell anemia, that have risen to relatively high frequency because in their heterozygote in one copy, they protect against malaria. So it shows what a big killer malaria has been, that its selection actually raises a disease in frequency. So there are many instances of diseases which are more common in one population than in another.
I might jump in there as well. And this idea that a disease might rise to high frequency because of either drift or selection, that's still a big question with these different diseases we see in Ireland. Cystic fibrosis, hemochromatosis, are they high just through bad luck and small population size? Or potentially there's been studies that shows that, again, a heterozygote advantage, that maybe with one copy of the cystic fibrosis mutation might protect you from tuberculosis or diseases that the Irish population have been subject to in the past. Hemochromatosis as well, if you're not getting much iron in your diet, potentially in the past, having one copy might help. But that's an ongoing question.
Thank you, Dan and Lara. I mean, that's a really interesting way to think about things that we normally think of as very, very bad. You don't think of them as being protecting against something. So thank you for that. And we have Laura Carpenter has asked a question that a few people actually, it seems, would like to know the answer to. And she says, epigenetic studies on the Dutch hunger winter suggest the famine has an effect on later populations. For example, the increased incidence of schizophrenia. Has much research been done on the long-term influence of the Irish famine?
I'll take that if you don't mind. I think those epigenetic studies of transgenerational epigenetics are not terribly convincing. The numbers are not very high, so I'm not terribly convinced by them, to be quite honest. The Irish famine probably had some genetic impact, but it's the one that we often think of. But the reason we often think of it is that it's because it's the most recent famine. Famine was probably more of a norm episodically in Irish prehistory than we imagine. So famines rather than famine will have had an impact, perhaps in disease-resistant genes, perhaps in genes to do with metabolism. But we haven't really tied those down terribly well, not yet. So I would say famines, yes, but the Irish famine, I wouldn't pin hopes on it having had a dramatic impact.
Thank you, Dan.
So it's had a dramatic impact on the genetic makeup maybe of other world regions with outward migration from the island. I think that's really the big genomic legacy of the Irish famine.
Yeah, it had a dramatic impact on people, of course, but on the genome, not necessarily.
We actually have another question here, Dan, that takes us up to your part of the world, from Brian Call. He says, in the northwest of our island, there is a belief that the ancestry of the male lines of many families can be traced through the O'Neill dynasties to Niall of the Nine Hostages in the late 4th and early 5th centuries. Is this pure romantic myth, or can it be verified by modern genomic research?
Well, actually, we did that work, published it in 2006. So yes, if you take Y chromosome fingerprints, so a detailed genetic fingerprint of the Y chromosome, which is passed down from male to male, you find that there is one particular variant, that's one type that's common in Ireland and particularly common in the northwest, and that coincides with an area where there's a lot of people with surnames, that those surnames are associated with the lineages that go back to this character called Niall of the Nine Hostages, who may or may not have existed. But he had sons called Connell and Owen, as in Tyrconnell and Tyrone, supposedly, and they had dynasties set up in the northwest. So it's plausible. I think it's plausible. I think I would like to see a little more. We published it and we suggested that more, but it's 15 years ago now. I'd like to see a follow-up to see how well it stands up. And we haven't done the follow-up, but I'd like to see that.
Sticking with the legendary figures, Philip Beck and a few others would like to know if the legends of the Fomorians and Tuatha De Danann actually tell of a folk memory of the pre-migration populations who were replaced by the people migrating to Ireland in prehistory.
I think so many people's origin stories involve migrations. It's not just something we see in Irish mythology. And there was a really big push, I think, in the early medieval period to try to link everything back to the Bible, and have movement from Eastern Mediterranean regions. So I think it's very speculative to say that there would be, over such long periods of time, a lasting memory. But I don't know, Dan, what would you think?
It's asking a lot for an oral history to survive over thousands of years. That's what I think. Yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah, we'd love to have a solid answer, but it's not something you can really research, is it?
It's hard.
The bones won't tell you that. And we have a few questions with people interested in the Neanderthals. So Peter Gorman here asks, how does the Neanderthal contribution in Ireland compare with the contribution elsewhere in Europe?
Very similar. Europeans have very similar levels of Neanderthal ancestry. East Asians have slightly more Neanderthal ancestry, and the actual dilution of Neanderthal ancestry in Europeans is due to that agricultural movement in the Neolithic period from the Middle East.
So it's low. It's only a couple of percent, yeah.
Yeah. It's 2 to 3%, I think.
Yeah.
I, for one, find that a relief. Philip Beck would like to know: are the bones you assess all from the ruling class because they were buried in passage tombs, etc.? Were ordinary people not being assessed? Hence, in a population of 100,000 spread over an entire Ireland, the probability of close relations must be quite high.
So that's a good question. Well, we can only work with what's there, but not all our samples came from megalithic tombs. We had some cave samples, so they show the same basic background. But in fact, one of the things that we're arguing is that some of these bones do come from a ruling class because they do come from passage tombs and they are related to each other. That's one of the things we are arguing.
I think it's a really interesting question that, I don't know, it's usually in the archaeological record, people who can afford a nice fancy burial are the ones who are discovered, and that there might be invisible groups in the past. And I think that, sampling cave sites and cave archaeology and things like that, accidental burials and stuff is a really important area of sampling, I think, for ancient DNA.
Well, we've had questions about the Neanderthals, and now we're going into a few different groups. John Chamney would like to know about the Celts. So what part do they play in our story? What influence have they had? How does it compare to the never mentioned Vikings and the lesser lights, the Normans?
Oh, it's much easier to talk about who the Vikings and the Normans are, I think, compared to what on earth Celt actually means. That it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Like traditionally, Celts were seen, they were discussed in the classical literature as groups living west of the Danube. These were later linked to different archaeological cultures in Central Europe that you see spread south and east and relate to recordings of Celtic movements in the classical literature. And then you have the Celtic language family, which is a different thing again, which was again linked to the classical Celts and these material cultures. So I don't know. You've got a lot of different definitions. I think in terms of ancient genomics, we can probably maybe best talk about windows for language entry to Ireland and Celtic language entry. When did the insular Celtic languages become established in the islands? And we didn't talk about, but these Bronze Age migrations from the steppe region into Northern Europe, they are associated with the movement and spread of Indo-European languages as well, of which the Celtic language family is one member. We have steppe movement or movement of steppe peoples southwards into India and Iran, which would have given rise to the Indo-Iranian branch of the family. So with our early Bronze Age migrations and the scale of population replacement, there is an opportunity there for a change then of language. Whether that was the introduction of Celtic, that's very, very debatable. And I think Dan kind of pointed, we want to do more sampling in the later Bronze Age and Iron Age to look at these sort of more traditional windows of when Celtic people are meant to have arrived in Ireland or brought with them the Celtic language, and kind of the sort of the famous cultural packages associated with that, like Hallstatt and Latin art. But I don't know, Dan, do you want to add anything to that?
No, that's all good. Yeah.
Well, continuing on the theme of incoming migration, we have two questions involving migration in from Spain. So Peter Ryan has asked, what impact, if any, did the survivors of the Spanish Armada that landed on the Western Shores have on the native gene pool in that region? And bear with me, Conan O'Brien would like to know which one of the migration waves into Ireland originated from Spain. Was it the early Bronze Age? So two totally different periods, but same area.
So I'll answer the first one, maybe Lara the second one. So it's highly unlikely the Armada left any substantial impact, because there's written accounts. For example, there's an Armada leader called de Cuellar who left a written account of how he got back to Spain, and he got back to Spain by the skin of his teeth. He was shipwrecked on the west coast, and he was robbed by the native Irish. He was chased down by the crown, and he just about got back to Spain. So if he's anyway typical, the idea that these sort of swarthy, good-looking Spaniards came ashore and altered the gene pool of the west coast is just nonsense. Now, having said that, the rocky natural harbours of the west probably had trade and commerce with Spain over hundreds, if not thousands of years. So it's quite possible there are Spanish influences particular to the west coast because of that, but not because of the Armada. So Lara, you know about the second bit.
The second question, where did the populations coming in with farming and with the Bronze Age originate? And I think the immediate answer for that, really, when it comes to Ireland, is always France. So France is the launch pad, really, into Britain and Ireland. And often then we see movement from France through Britain into Ireland, the same sort of cultural packages coming through. In terms of broader origins, I think you're talking then about who's coming into France and where are they coming from. And with farming, with agriculture spreading through Europe, we actually have two sort of major kind of highways of migration, one going along the Mediterranean quite rapidly. This is probably voyaging and enclave colonization with seafaring. And they then, in the Western Mediterranean, they move upwards and into France and into northern France. We then have another arm of migration coming up through the Danube Valley. So this is overland. And coming into France via sort of the Rhine Valley. So we've got these two big arms of migration, with agriculture meeting in France and mingling, and also mingling with local hunter-gatherer populations. And it's that very dynamic region that then we're having movement into Ireland. And what the genetics is telling us currently is it seems that the Mediterranean stream has had more of an influence there. Early farming societies in Ireland look more closely related to farming groups in the Mediterranean and groups in Spain. But that doesn't tell you that there's any direct movement from Spain to Ireland during this period. It's just that they're all part of this sort of broader Mediterranean expansion. The Bronze Age, that's really another really interesting question. And in the Bronze Age, I think you really have to think like Britain and Ireland are two islands, but they have sometimes quite different orientations. I've heard this before. Britain is sort of an island of the North Sea, and Ireland can sometimes be an island of the Atlantic. And there can be a bit of a sort of a tug of war in terms of zones of cultural influence going on. So when we have the steppe movement coming into Ireland and replacement in the Bronze Age, this is very similar to what we're seeing in Britain, and the ultimate source populations seem to be from Northern Europe. Okay, so this is sort of a Northern European phenomenon. That said, when we look at the material culture and look at some of the stuff happening in the Copper and early Bronze Age in Ireland, we see things like the construction of new types of megalithic tombs called wedge tombs, which have a very Western distribution in Ireland. And they're most similar to tombs that we see constructed in Brittany in the northwest of France. We also potentially see maybe more of a persistence of the earlier farming ancestries in Ireland and the West at this period too. So this could potentially speak to some Atlantic connectivity up and down the seaboard during the early Bronze Age, and potentially connectivity with Spain. And then as we move forward into the Bronze Age, that whole Atlantic zone, we see something called the Atlantic Bronze Age in the late Bronze Age, where all of these Atlantic regions are quite well connected with one another through trade links. So that was a roundabout way of what links we see with Spain, but probably varied through time. But when we talk about movement and migration to Ireland in prehistory, we're usually more looking at France than anywhere else.
Great. Thank you for an incredibly comprehensive answer, Lara. Much appreciated. We have time for maybe 2 more questions, I think. So we have one from Catherine McGurk, bringing us back to disease and genomics. She says, to what extent can you analyze disease-associated variants from ancient DNA samples?
Well, there's 2 answers to that. First of all, we can find variants that we already know about. You know, it's because we sequence genomes in such depth and detail that we can and do find variants that are in the present population in the past. And that's interesting because it tells us something about how old they are, because some diseases are relatively recent and some of them are very old. And it's interesting. It doesn't necessarily help us cure them, but it is interesting. And then the second thing is, can we discover new mutations in the past? And the answer is sometimes yes. So for example, we have worked on a bone disease and in individuals in collaboration with Eileen Murphy in Belfast. And we have sequenced those to try and can we find the mutations that caused those bone diseases in the past. So that can be done, but it's more limited.
Thank you. And our final question today, there's a few people who'd like to know the answer to this one. For Cornelia Lillis asks, for those of us with a mixed heritage who might want to pinpoint our origins more precisely, do you know how accurate or legitimate the DNA tests available online are? I'm sure you get this question not infrequently.
Yeah. The DNA tests online are very good at finding you cousins. If you want to find more cousins, if you don't have enough cousins, you can get more cousins. Whenever they give you an estimate of your ancestry, the answer you get out depends on what is put in. Your genome is put in, but also it depends what the comparison set is. So that's really an important part of it. And also people don't tend to, I haven't done this myself. I don't know if you have, Lara, but they don't tend to give you errors. So if somebody says you're 3% North African or Moroccan or something like that, that estimate might be plus or minus 3%. So that's something I would inquire about too. What are the error margins? So they have some value, but if you get a single answer back, don't take it as the final answer. That's what I would say. What do you think, Lara? Would you agree?
I think so. And I think you are going to see improvements, as Dan said, as the comparative data sets grow, precision increases and error bars will probably narrow. But if they're not giving you that information, if they're not telling you what the size of the error margins are, yes, take anything in the low percents with a healthy grain of caution, I would say. They're very useful though if you're interested in recent genealogy and looking at your family pedigree going back 5-6 generations. They can really help you out if the written records aren't there. And I think that's quite useful, especially in Ireland, where we lost a lot of the census records in fires. So that would be my opinion.
Thank you both. That is both helpful and diplomatic. Thank you. I think that's unfortunately all we have time for. We have a lot of questions we didn't get to today, and I'm really sorry for that. But I would like to thank everybody for participating in what has been an incredibly fascinating webinar. It was really great to have such enthusiastic audience participation. I'd like to also say a huge thank you particularly to Dan and Lara for generously giving us their time today and giving us such a great glimpse into Ireland's genetic history. I'd like to thank my colleague Alexandra Owens, who's been in the background helping put this webinar together. And finally, of course, thank you all for listening and for sharing your questions. If you would like more information on today's topic, you can check out the links at the bottom of the screen here, which were supplied by Dan and Lara. These will also be shared in a follow-up email later today, so don't worry about scrambling to write them down there. Our next webinar in the Inspiring Ideas at Trinity series will take place in 2 weeks' time on Wednesday, the 17th of November. It's called Navigating Cyberspace, Knowing Who and What to Trust. And our guest speakers will be Professor Dave Lewis, who's Associate Director at the ADAPT Center for Digital Content Research, and 2 professors from the School of Computer Science and Statistics here at Trinity, Dr. Stephen Farrell and Professor Owen Conlon. We're really looking forward to an engaging conversation where you'll learn about the latest developments in the area of cybersecurity, including ethical implications of using new AI technology and how you can tell if what you see online is true or misinformation. If you have any questions or comments regarding this webinar series or any other questions you'd like to ask of us here at Trinity Development and Alumni, please email us at alumni@tcd.ie. Just to say, details on how to register for the next webinar will be emailed in the next few days. So in the meantime, thank you once again for joining us and take care.